Tommy, in fact, I think was a very courageous thing to do in 1969, I think it was.
Right.
George Martin entered Abbey Road Studios as a classically trained musician, but he left his mark as someone who fundamentally transformed how popular music was made. Before he became famous for his work with the Beatles, Martin spent his time producing comedy albums and jazz recordings. He had a deep understanding of musical timing and structure, and he knew how to record performances that felt genuine and full of life. What set Martin apart from other producers was his unique way of hearing music. Where most people heard guitars, he heard orchestras. Where others saw limitations, he saw endless possibilities. Martin's greatest skill was his ability to translate musical ideas into reality. When Paul McCartney would hum string arrangements, Martin could turn those hummed melodies into the beautiful orchestration heard on Yesterday. When John Lennon described his carnival-inspired dreams, Martin brought them to life in Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. He did more than simply record the Beatles. He enhanced their sound, elevated their music, and made their wildest creative visions become tangible realities. His classical training combined with their raw talent created a powerful collision that neither could have achieved working alone. Behind every groundbreaking Beatles recording sat Martin at the mixing desk, staying calm and thoughtful while figuring out how to make seemingly impossible ideas work. He approached the recording studio as if it were a musical instrument itself. Tape speed, reverb, orchestration, and every other technical element were tools waiting to be used properly. The albums Martin loved most were not just records he enjoyed listening to. They were lessons in craftsmanship and innovation, teaching him how to serve the artist while simultaneously pushing creative boundaries. Martin's classical foundation started with Johann Sebastian Bach. When he heard Glenn Gould's recording of the Goldberg Variations from 1955, it changed how he understood musical performance. Gould did not simply play Bach's music as written, he reimagined it completely, taking harpsichord compositions and making them sing on a modern piano. His interpretation was controversial, featuring fast tempos and unusual dynamics, but the performance was undeniably alive with energy. Martin heard someone who refused to follow convention, someone who made old music feel new through sheer force of creative vision. What struck Martin was Gould's incredible precision. Every single note was perfectly placed, yet the performance never felt mechanical or cold. Humanity shone through the mathematical structure of Bach's architecture, turning it into an emotional landscape. Martin studied this careful balance. How could something be technically flawless while also being deeply moving at the same time? That question would come to define his entire production philosophy. The Beatles needed to be in tune and in time, but they also needed to be real and human. Gould demonstrated that both qualities were possible together. The recording itself broke new ground. The piano was closely mic'd, creating an intimate sound. You could occasionally hear Gould humming while he played. Some producers would have edited those sounds out, but the engineer left them in, making the performance feel more human. Martin absorbed this important lesson. Technical perfection mattered greatly, but so did capturing the person behind the instrument. Later, he would leave in the Beatles' studio banter, their laughter, and their humanity. Gould proved that classical music could be radical, that respecting tradition did not mean being trapped by it. Martin discovered Miles Davis's and Gil Evans' collaboration from 1960 and saw production as a true art form. Sketches of Spain merged jazz with classical music and flamenco influences. Evans' orchestral arrangements were breathtaking, lush, and complex, yet Miles's trumpet cut through everything with simple beauty. The balance between them was perfect, with neither overwhelming the other. Martin studied how Evans created his orchestrations, how he gave Miles space to breathe while surrounding him with beautiful orchestral colors. The album adapted Rodrigo's classical piece for a jazz ensemble in Concierto de Aranjuez, featuring 18 minutes of Miles playing with a Spanish orchestra. The production was spacious and reverberant. Each instrument occupied its own distinct location in the stereo field. Martin paid close attention to this technique. How you place sounds in the mix mattered just as much as the sounds themselves. Later, he would use these same techniques on Beatles recordings, placing voices in one speaker and instruments in another to create dimension and depth. What fascinated Martin most was Evans's courage. Using a full orchestra in a jazz context was risky when radio stations wanted 3-minute songs. This was art created for its own sake. But the artistry made it essential and meaningful. Martin would remember this when the Beatles wanted to use sitars, when they wanted 40-piece orchestras on pop songs. Evans proved that ambitious ideas could succeed if they were executed brilliantly. This album showed Martin that the producer and arranger were true creative partners, that their vision could equal the performer's contribution to the final work. Frank Sinatra's album from 1955 taught Martin about emotional architecture in music. This was the first true concept album, featuring 15 songs that explored loneliness and heartbreak. Nelson Riddle's arrangements were subtle masterpieces, with strings that ached and woodwinds that sighed. Everything supported Sinatra's voice without competing with it for attention. Martin recognized this as production genius, knowing exactly what to add and what to remove, serving the emotion above everything else. Sinatra recorded these songs during 3 in the morning sessions. His voice was raw from cigarettes and whiskey. The record company could have fixed it and smoothed it out, but they were right to leave it alone. That rasp was honest. That wear was real. The imperfection made it perfect. Later, when John Lennon wanted his voice to sound more real and raw, Martin understood completely. Sometimes, polish destroys truth. The song sequencing created a journey, opening with the title track and building through mounting desperation, ending without resolution but with acceptance. Martin learned that album order mattered, that the flow between songs could tell stories. Sgt. Pepper would later use this exact approach, creating a unified experience rather than a random collection of songs. Sinatra and Riddle proved that popular music deserved serious treatment, that craftsmanship elevated rather than constrained creativity. They showed you could break hearts in 3 minutes if every element served that emotional purpose. Martin heard Buddy Holly's debut from 1957 and recognized a peer in Norman Petty, who produced these sessions in Clovis, New Mexico. The sound was clean and bright. Buddy's voice was recorded with slight echo, guitars were positioned perfectly, and drums were punchy without overwhelming the mix. Petty understood what Martin would later prove in his own work. The producer's job was making artists sound like their best selves, not imposing a foreign vision onto their music.
The opening track started with drums counting in, which was unusual for 1957. Most productions erased these moments, but Petty left it in. This made the recording feel live and present. Martin noted this choice carefully. Years later, he would count in "I Saw Her Standing There" the same way. Those human touches connected listeners to performances and made records feel immediate and real. Hawley's arrangements were deceptively sophisticated. Vocal harmonies were perfectly stacked, guitar parts interlocked beautifully, and everything was recorded simply but positioned brilliantly in the mix. Martin studied Petty's economy, learning how to achieve maximum impact with minimal fuss. Not every song needed an orchestra. Sometimes guitar, bass, and drums were enough if they were recorded properly and placed well. The innovation existed in the details. Hawley's voice was occasionally double-tracked, hand claps were added for texture, and studio techniques were used subtly, never drawing attention to the production itself, but simply making great songs sound even greater. Martin built his entire career on this philosophy. Technology should serve the music, not the other way around. Phil Spector's Christmas album from 1963 showed Martin the opposite extreme. Where Sinatra was subtle, Spector was bombastic. His wall of sound technique layered dozens of instruments together, using multiple pianos, multiple guitars, echo chambers, and everything compressed into massive sonic force. Various artists sang with orchestras behind them, and Martin recognized this as revolutionary production. It was completely different from his own approach, but undeniably powerful. Spector did not simply capture performances, he built them, overdub by overdub, layer by layer, creating sounds that could not exist in live performance. The studio as an instrument concept was taken to extremes. Martin admired the ambition, even when the aesthetic was not his own. Later, when the Beatles wanted bigger sounds, Spector's influence appeared in their work. The orchestra on A Day in the Life and the production density of Strawberry Fields Forever showed this influence. What Martin took from Spector was courage. He learned not to accept limitations. If technology did not exist, you should invent it. If you needed 50 instruments, you should use 50 instruments. Spector never asked permission. He demanded excellence and found ways to achieve it. That fearlessness inspired Martin deeply. When Paul wanted backwards guitars, Martin figured out how to do it. When they wanted tape loops, he made it happen. Spector proved that producers could be artists themselves, that production itself was creative expression. Martin just chose to use different paintbrushes. Brian Wilson's masterpiece from 1966 arrived when Martin was producing Revolver. Both albums pushed boundaries at the same time. Wilson used unconventional instruments everywhere, including bicycle bells, barking dogs, harpsichords, and theremins. His arrangements were dense but clear, with every element audible and every choice purposeful. Martin heard someone working at his own level, taking pop music seriously as an art form. Wilson's production techniques fascinated Martin. He would record instruments at different speeds, build vocal harmonies layer by layer, and use echo and reverb as compositional tools themselves. One song featured French horn and accordion in a love song. It should not have worked, but it became perfect. Martin understood that sometimes the wrong instrument was exactly right. He would put a sitar on Norwegian wood shortly after hearing this album. The ambition was staggering. Wilson was deaf in one ear and produced in mono, yet he created sonic landscapes richer than most stereo recordings. That paradox intrigued Martin greatly. Limitations could force creativity. Later, working with 4-track recording equipment, Martin would make albums that sounded like they used 40 tracks. Wilson showed that constraints could become advantages if you were inventive enough. This album validated Martin's belief that producers should be true collaborators. Wilson co-wrote the songs, but also realized them sonically. The production was not separate from composition, it was composition itself. Martin would take this philosophy even further with the Beatles in their later work together. Martin chose the album he produced himself not out of ego, but out of honesty. Sgt. Pepper's from 1967 represented everything he believed music could become. The Beatles brought raw talent and endless creative ideas. Martin brought classical training and studio mastery. Together, they created something unprecedented in popular music. It was an album as unified artwork, with every song flowing into the next and production as integral as songwriting itself. Recording took 4 months and 700 hours of studio time. They used 4-track recording equipment, but bounced between machines to build up layers of sound. The tabla on Within You Without You, the orchestra on A Day in the Life, and the backwards guitar on I'm Only Sleeping, each required extensive problem solving. Martin figured out solutions and made the impossible become possible. What made this album sacred was the collaboration between all involved. Paul would hum string arrangements, and Martin would transcribe and orchestrate them properly using his classical training. John would describe fever dreams and abstract visions, and Martin would translate them into concrete studio techniques. George Harrison wanted authentic Indian music, so Martin found the right musicians. Ringo needed a circus atmosphere for his song, and Martin created it. Martin's classical background met their instincts, and the fusion created magic. This album proved Martin's entire philosophy about production. Producers should elevate artists, enable their vision, bring technical expertise without imposing their own aesthetics, and serve the music above all else. Sgt. Pepper's changed what albums could be, and changed what production meant in popular music. It was Martin's finest moment, not because he led the process, but because he followed the Beatles' vision so brilliantly, while adding his own essential contributions. George Martin never chased the spotlight or sought fame for himself. These 7 albums taught him about craft, courage, and collaboration. His production work soared to great heights because these masters showed him how to fly. Each album offered different lessons that shaped his approach to making music. From Bach, he learned that technical perfection and emotional depth could coexist. From Miles Davis and Gil Evans, he learned about spatial arrangement and ambitious orchestration. From Sinatra, he learned about emotional honesty and the power of imperfection. From Buddy Holly, he learned about economy and subtle innovation. From Phil Spector, he learned about fearless ambition. From Brian Wilson, he learned that production itself could be composition. And through his own work on Sgt. Pepper's, he demonstrated that all these lessons could come together to create something truly revolutionary that changed music forever.